Hello, everyone. So, welcome to our discussion for our MTA HTML5 exam, Lesson 9. This is sort of the advanced coverage of some of our JavaScript options. So, in the last section, we talked briefly about why we use JavaScript and what it is. And we talked about how it's sort of the interactive layer of the web. It allows us to provide and control just about everything from your user experience and your user flow. And it's pretty powerful. So last time we just scratched the surface on what it can do, and we talked mostly about how it interacts with our document object model by adding and removing elements and sort of changing all of the properties of everything that's on the page. Today we're going to dive into some slightly more advanced topics, and this chapter is structured a little strangely, but I'll try to follow its structure. We sort of hit let's see, I think this is 7 topics, sort of in a rapid fire succession. The book gives each of them about a page of good treatment. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about each of these, and I'll try to add some color where it seems like it's needed. So let's get started. So I know a lot of you have a fairly large interest in sort of building video games or making some more interactive forms of entertainment. And that's sort of one of the big uses of JavaScript. So much so that there's some actually really powerful game engines that are 100% JavaScript. But sort of this treatment of animation in JavaScript is sort of based around a couple of different features that we have built into JavaScript and CSS. But sort of the idea is that, obviously animation is sort of this concept of displaying a number of frames in quick succession to give the illusion of movement. And if we talk about this sort of in video, the idea is that we show a bunch of still images to sort of give this illusion of transition. When we're talking about JavaScript in the form of a web page, we typically talk about animating different UI elements, not necessarily characters or scenes. So we may have a menu that slowly slides open. We may have some sort of loading icon that moves around the screen or that slowly grows and vanishes as the new page is loaded, or some other really interesting animation features. Typically, especially on most business-oriented websites, you don't see heavy use of animation sort of as the main body or meat of the website. It's sort of used as a really nice decoration. But it's still really fun to play with. So we'll talk about that a bit. So the book talks about this concept of recursion as sort of the basic way of doing animation in JavaScript. And this is sort of what we've played with so far. So our first actual animation example that we did in class, we used the set timeout function, and we sort of recursively called the same function over and over with a delay to sort of move items across the screen and change colors of things gradually or increase the size or rotation. And that's sort of the idea. In basic JavaScript animation, that's how we do it. We typically say that we will move an element, say, 10 pixels to the right. So we sort of set up this process of saying, move this item 1 pixel to the right, then 100 milliseconds later, move it 1 pixel to the right, then 100 milliseconds later, move it one pixel to the right, and we keep doing this process, and it sort of iteratively gives us this illusion of animation. And that's the basic idea. So the simple example that we did in class dealt with moving items across the screen and changing some sizing. And that's a similar example to what the book actually gives us in its example on page 217 and 218. So we can animate in a couple of different ways. The first way is actually by using our position. So we can use JavaScript and this set timeout sort of methodology to continuously update the position or width or height of different elements. And we do that sort of incrementally. So we can access this data using the document object model sort of through our style tag. So the basic process is that we select an element in the page using our get element by ID. We then access that element's dot style property, and maybe if we want to move it, we'll access that element's dot left property. And then once we have that property, we can simply change it. So we can assign a new value to it. We may do something as simple as paragraph.style.left plus equals 1, and that will increment the position by 1 pixel to the left. So it's fairly straightforward to do our basic animations. We can sort of use the structure to accomplish any other animation that we want. So we can do this to change colors, we can change sizes, we can change positions, we can even incrementally draw strings onto the page if we sort of use the structure with our inner HTML property to update the contents. And there are a lot of options, so it's fun to play around with. And we did a few of these examples in class. So the book sort of goes next into understanding that we don't have to just move elements. So we can move things like images and other graphics around the page, but we actually have some special elements just to do animation in JavaScript. So the first thing that we actually talk about here is this canvas element. And this element is brand new to HTML5. I say brand new, HTML5 has been around for a while now, but it is still gaining popularity. This is a completely new concept. And it sort of provides us kind of like a blank canvas to draw items on. And when we draw things, we draw them by pixels. So however big we make our canvas, let's say 800 by 600, we have that many pixels on which to draw. And it sort of gets rendered into the web page, sort of as we draw it in JavaScript. And there's a couple of cool things about the canvas element. The first is that it has a fairly fast refresh rate. It's actually sort of intended to be fast to support things like games. So we can actually draw frames from games and interact with the user in that way. The other thing is you can actually save the canvas as if it were any other image. So on a web page, if you have a picture of a dog, you can right click it and save as. If you have a canvas that you've drawn with JavaScript, you can do the same thing and save it as, say, a PNG element or image. So it's pretty cool. You're actually drawing an image live in the page using JavaScript. So there is a really fun example that we have on page 220 where we sort of create an actual live updating analog clock. It's pretty cool. It's actually a fairly complex example. I encourage you to spend some time trying to understand it, and if not, actually try to reproduce it and see what's going on. But we'll talk about some of the special functions that they use in this example to actually accomplish this. So the canvas element is special. While we have a lot of properties like our style, and we can access attributes like our href and our source when we're using the document object model, the canvas has a bunch of special JavaScript functions to control and allow us to do this sort of pixel by pixel drawing. So sort of the first way that we do this is actually by calling this getContext function. So sort of every call to a draw when we're using a canvas in JavaScript starts off with getting the name of the canvas element, so get element by ID, whatever its ID is. Then we say canvas element dot get context, and we provided a context. So we can either get the 3-dimensional context or the 2-dimensional context. We won't go too deep into three-dimensional drawing, but you can sort of explore that on your own. We'll stick to the 2D right now. And once we have this context variable back, we can then start using that context to draw and update our pixels. So there's a couple of things we can do. So one of the basic ones is actually drawing paths. So you can see that on the example in page 221 at the top, you'll see that we have this function called begin path. And this is sort of the process that we go to draw items on a canvas. So we create a path, and then we move sort of our pointer or our cursor around, and then we perform some action. In this case, we're calling this draw leg function, which does some fancy math. We won't go into trig right now, but it draws a line from the center of our clock all the way to the outside, and then moves over 1 degree, and then draws a line back. And it sort of uses this drawing process to create a triangle. And then you'll see that we use this dContext.fill function call here to tell JavaScript to actually fill this in with a color. And that's sort of the process. There's some fairly complex flows that go into this for drawing objects. But we have a huge list of functions that we can use with our canvas, and we took a look at them the other day. There's something like 60, 80, so we definitely don't have time to go over all of them. But I would encourage you to take some time to be familiar with this begin path sort of process and understand how this example works when you're going over the studying. But this process of drawing items in the canvas is sort of unique to HTML5 and JavaScript, and it allows us to create some really cool animations. So in addition to actually drawing things with JavaScript, we have some other features that we can do. And this is where we're starting to get into the rapid fire bits of advanced features. So the first thing that we use JavaScript for that may not be apparent is we can actually send and receive data to and from a server. So similar to how you would open your browser and navigate to a web page and you would get an HTML file back, you can sort of do this process with anything. You can send what is called a request to a URL, and when you send a request, you typically get a response. When we're using a browser, that's sort of handled for us, but we sort of send a request asking for a HTML page, and we get an HTML page back. We can do this in JavaScript without actually relying on the browser, which is pretty cool. And we talk about here the concept of this XML HTTP request. And it's one of the basic built-in methods for JavaScript to actually send some sort of request to a server and get a response back. We talk about this XML HTTP request specifically because it works very nicely with one of Microsoft's technologies. So Microsoft, at least at the time of this book, spent a lot of time pushing web methods, which are typically based on HTML calls. So the method that we talk about here is the one for dealing with XML. So we, in addition to doing XML calls, we actually can send other data and get other data back. And we'll talk about briefly some of the other functions, or some of the other formats of data that are slightly more used these days. But the basic concepts are the same. We create some sort of data, and we form it into what is called a request. We send the request to a URL, and then if there's a server there that's listening, it will take our request and respond with some sort of answer. And we can sort of do this in JavaScript. When we do this, the user doesn't see any action happening in their browser. It sort of happens behind the scenes. Um, but the cool thing about this is we can sort of do these requests invisibly, and if something changes, we can go ahead and update the UI for the user. So without the user having to click on anything or load anything, we can actually redraw and refresh the web page or just specific portions of the web page. So it's pretty cool. And this concept is used very heavily these days. Um, we can also do it on the request of a user. So instead of creating links for the user to navigate through a web page with, we can sort of create special JavaScript buttons that when the user clicks on them, something like an XML HTTP request is made, some information is gotten back, and then the whole page is redrawn using JavaScript. And this process, as I mentioned earlier, is actually one of the core pieces of JavaScript that supports our single page application structure, where most of our web pages these days are sort of built with the idea that nothing ever really loads. Everything's done through JavaScript. And we sort of see how we're mimicking this go out to a URL and download a web page structure completely inside of JavaScript. The advantage being, of course, it is a better experience for the user. They don't have to worry about waits and load times in a browser, and that, few hundred milliseconds difference is becoming very important these days with this very impatient generation of internet users. So we sort of use this process to generate our dynamic single page applications. And I think I have already talked about this before we pulled the slide, so I'll go ahead and continue onto sort of some other information about transmitting objects. So one of the special things about how we send this data is that we're more or less always sending text. That's really all we can send, period. But it's almost always formatted in a special way. It's not just raw unstructured text. So similar to how we get an HTML document back, it's all just text. It's formatted in a special way called HTML. Same thing with JavaScript and same thing with CSS. So when we're talking about the XML HTTP request, what we're referring to is that the data we're sending is in XML format. And we've talked about XML format as sort of the broad category of HTML, which consists of any tagged data. But sort of this process of getting text and translating things to and from text has a special name. So we typically talk about serializing some sort of data that we have stored in memory into this string representation, some sort of text representation. And when we convert it back, we call that deserialization. So we typically have all of our data in our program stored in variables. And we can only perform operations on variables. We can't, we add variables, we loop on variables, we make branches based on variables. Everything is done with variables, but we can't send variables. We have to serialize them into text in order to send them over the network. So we sort of use these formats to to translate things into text into a similar way and understand how servers are going to talk to each other. So one of the most widely used formats these days is what is called JSON, and it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And quite simply, this is basically a text representation of a JavaScript object. So we can actually send anything in JavaScript to a server by turning it into this JSON format. It doesn't really matter what it is, there's support for showing it in JSON, which is pretty cool. And there's a lot of built-in support for this process with JSON. In fact, I think it's a one-liner to take anything in JavaScript and turn it into a text for JSON, and one line to take anything that is JSON and turn it back into an actual JavaScript object. So this particular data manipulation in this particular format is really widely used, and you will actually see JSON as sort of the basis of almost all of our API calls and all of our APIs that we'll be interacting with. So moving on to the next bullet point in this list. So we can use JavaScript to sort of manage our file and image uploading. So typically when we are building web forms, we can use our image and file uploader input format to accept a file, and whenever we submit the page, we actually get a copy of that file. But it doesn't really matter what they put in that box. There's not a lot of checking we can do. That's where JavaScript comes in. So JavaScript can actually interact with the files on the client side and sort of understand things about them, like the file size or the file type, maybe even some things about when it was modified, to sort of pre-filter these files. So, we may want to have a check to make sure that the user is not uploading a 100 gigabyte satellite image into our service and is basically going to crash our server. We may have size limits to sort of make sure that the experience is good for everyone. And we can use JavaScript to test for all of this. So, sort of next on our bullet point list is understanding this application cache. And this is a really interesting feature where we can actually define a special manifest file called the app cache. And this cache basically is instructions to store pages of our website in the browser cache, which means that we can actually visit and use parts of this web page offline. So it's pretty neat for some cases. It's not super widely used, but it's actually fairly simple to implement. If we create an app cache manifest file, we simply add it in our HTML tag, and we provide the link, the URL to it, and it defines all of our options. So one other thing on our list of bullet points here is that we can use JavaScript to validate user form input. So one of the cool things that we can do is we can actually listen to when users are interacting with individual form elements. So I mentioned that we have a bunch of different HTML events here, especially around forms. And we can respond to each of these differently. So let's say the user's typing in a product ID number into a text box, and it needs a specific format. Maybe four characters, a hyphen, and then 4 numerals. We can actually check on each keystroke using our key down event using JavaScript if what they have entered currently matches what we expect. And we can use this to say, maybe display a window alert to the user saying that there's an issue, or we may actually have some nicer errors such as a highlight the box in red. And basically the idea here is that we sort of have this general structure of we can take any HTML event and link it to a piece of JavaScript and force sort of use that JavaScript to check whatever changed on that particular piece of HTML. And this is sort of the basis of our validation. So when we call these functions, we refer them as validator functions, and they should actually either say that everything's good to go or pop up some sort of error. And we can use this in conjunction with our existing HTML5 validation options. It's just that we're a little bit restricted in what we can do with our HTML5 validation. When we use JavaScript, we can basically do anything we need. So it's actually a lot more powerful, and we may have to use this depending on the special requirements of our site. So next on our punch list are cookies. So, um, cookies have a bad rap. Um, Typically, people think of cookies sort of as the bad things that get you in trouble, or the bad things that nefarious websites put on your computer to track you. And while that's definitely true, they're very useful for websites, and they're actually not super nefarious when we think about what they are. So cookies are actually just small bits of data saved in the browser about a web page. So a web page can has this special sandbox where it can read and write any information, but it can only see its own sandbox. So we can sort of put data in the sandbox, and whenever this browser is opened back up, if we go back to this page can read any data that it's saved there, which is really helpful. So we can use cookies for very, very useful things like remembering what you've put in your shopping cart, for instance. Even if you haven't signed into any sort of account. We can also use cookies for things like remembering which user was last logged in, um, remembering if you have, say, a banking session of, say, only 30 minutes, and making sure that the next time you try to perform an action, that it needs to validate or relog you in for your security. And we can also use it for the not so nice functions like tracking people across different websites and different domains. So cookies are pretty simple. We basically have a special JavaScript property, the document.cookie property, and we more or less do two things. We either assign to the cookie property or we read from the cookie property. And that's about it. That's how we interact with cookies. Um, Cookies are actually fairly simple. They don't have a lot of complexity. There is one cookie per web page. Um, I know there's a bit of a misnomer, but we can put a lot of data inside of that one cookie and sort of treat it as multiple pieces of data. Um, there's sort of a good example of how to do that on page 236, where they create these special functions called set cookie and get cookie that sort of handles a lot of the parsing of cookie properties. So in addition to cookies, we have another way of storing data, and that's actually in this sort of concept called local storage. And in JavaScript, we have another special property called local storage, nicely enough. And basically, it is we can treat it like a JavaScript object. So we can set any property of this local storage object, and it is persistent, which means that if we close this page and load it again, whatever we set in this local storage object stays there. And it's a little bit easier to interact with than cookies. So the book heavily recommends using local storage instead of cookies for a number of different reasons. The Not the least of which is the fact that your local storage is typically stored encrypted, whereas your cookies are not, by default anyway. So that's sort of the punch list of the key terms review that we have in lesson 9 for this book. There's actually one section I skipped over, but I want to talk about this now. It didn't seem to fit where it was placed in the book. And we've spent a lot of time talking about this when we talked about the details and syntax of JavaScript, but it's good to remember. So on page 233, there's a half of a page on understanding data types in JavaScript, which we know is actually a fairly complex topic. But the basic thing we need to remember is that JavaScript actually tries to convert things for us. So if we have the character 3 added to the numeral 3, then JavaScript will give us the numeral 6. So it will try to turn the character into a numeral, then perform the addition. But that only happens in some cases. So if we start mixing numerals and characters, we may end up with this strange mix of addition and string concatenation. So we can get some very odd behavior. So we need to pay attention to what JavaScript is actually doing under the hood. And one of the interesting points that this book makes is that different JavaScript interpreters, aka different browsers, will actually sometimes perform this in different ways. While this was something definitely to pay attention to, I think there's been a lot of standards improvement over the years, and I think the behavior is pretty much predictable across browsers these days. But it is still a little complicated, and it's good to pay attention to. The other thing to note about this is that we do have two different comparison operators because of this. We have our double equal sign, which is sort of our normal does this variable equal this variable. And we also have this new special triple equal sign, which not only does this variable equal this variable check, but it checks that they are the same type. So in JavaScript, the character 7 is equal to the numeral 7. In most other programming languages, that is not true, but in JavaScript it is. If we use the triple equal sign, the character 7 is not equal to the numeral 7. So we should spend some time paying attention to those distinctions in JavaScript data types. So quickly, we should recap what we talked about here and the 7 different topics that we intended to cover in this section. So we started off by talking about basic animation. And with basic animation, we're updating different pieces of HTML elements by changing sort of the CSS properties. And that's fairly straightforward and pretty fun to play around with. But we also have some other options to create more advanced drawing properties. So one of the biggest features of HTML5 that was added is our canvas object, which allows us to create pixel by pixel drawings. And while we can actually set these pixel by pixel by setting individual pixels, we typically use this using some special built-in functions. And we talked about how to use the stroke and fill functions a bit, in addition to the other, 60 or 80 different functions that we have available to us. So we also went into sending and receiving data using our XML HTTP request. And that's sort of the basic idea of sending data from the client's computer to a server and getting a response. And we can use this to update the user interface. We also talked about in this section the concept of JSON, which is when we're sending these requests to servers, we need some way to pack the data. And there's a special format built into JavaScript called JSON, which allows us to really easily pack anything in JavaScript into a good text representation to send to a server. And it's very, very widely used these days. So we also talked about the fact that we can use JavaScript to interact with the files on the user's computer. And we can use this to do some client-side validation. We do have limited access, we can't just access anything. But it's good for making sure that files that are selected for upload actually are the right file size and the right file type, and actually meet some other criteria. So along that same line, we typically can use JavaScript to validate our user form input. And we do this sort of by linking to our events on each of our form input elements. And on each of our form input elements, we sort of call some JavaScript that does some reading of whatever information the user just put in and can give the user some feedback about it. Let's say it may turn this box red if the input is not valid. We also talked about sort of the ability to store data on the client's computer. So we talked about using cookies. which the book and by extension Microsoft recommends is outdated, but it's still very useful. And we also talked about this new local storage property that's in JavaScript, and it's sort of a slightly more secure way of using cookies. So that is sort of the summary for lesson 9. Um, we talked about a bunch of different advanced topics at a very high level, and there's some really good examples in this section. Um, so I would encourage you to review the examples and try them out yourself if you haven't. Um, and as usual, make sure to go through the competency assessment and the proficiency assessment for this section to make sure that you sort of understand conceptually how things should work. Next time for lesson 10, we'll be talking about some very specific JavaScript functions that may not be present on all devices. So including touch interface, accessing device resources, and a couple of other topics. So thank you very much.